The helmet still hangs there, a dull gray shell, cracked along the temple, its leather strap stiff from the Texas sun. When the film opens, the camera closes in. The wind presses through the fence. A single tag clinks against the wire. A young American guard pauses. "That yours?" he asks. The German pilot standing beside him nods, his voice faint, dry from dust and pride. "It was my world." When 30 seconds in, the audience already understands this is not a story of victors and losers, but of what happens when a man forgets the sky he once owned. In 1943, after the fall of Tunisia, over 200 Luftwaffe officers were shipped to Camp Hearne, Texas, a small town built from wheat fields and barbed wire. The camp still exists as a museum today, its display cases filled with relics of captivity, spoons carved into chess pieces, hand-stitched letters home, and one cracked pilot helmet labeled "Captured in North Africa, 1943. Oberleutnant Karl Hoffmann arrived there on a late August afternoon. The desert was behind him, but the sand seemed to follow inside his boots. He was 26, a veteran of the Africa Corps' Air Wing, credited with 7 confirmed kills, and 1 unconfirmed conscience. His Messerschmitt Bf-109 had been shredded by a P-40 Warhawk over Medjez el-Bab. The Americans had dragged him from his parachute lines half-conscious and mumbling coordinates that no longer mattered. He expected hostility, spittle, fists, or mockery. What he found was order. Rows of barracks aligned like military formation, each numbered, each with flower beds planted by prisoners themselves. The guards called them by rank, not by insult. To a man trained in total control, this kindness felt more disarming than the capture itself. That night, he was issued a tin plate, a wool blanket, and silence. Lights out at 10. From his bunk, he could hear the cicadas, the thump of the distant train, and a gramophone from the American quarters playing Benny Goodman. For a brief moment, he thought he was hearing Berlin radio through interference. He whispered to himself in German, "If this is defeat, it sounds strangely alive." The next morning, he saw the helmet again, hanging outside, tagged and numbered, awaiting storage. Something in him wanted to reclaim it, yet he didn't. It no longer belonged to the man he was. He wrote a single sentence that day in his notebook, one historians later found among Camp Hearne's archives. "I once lived above the clouds, but freedom has more dust than air." The camera lingers on that helmet for a final beat before the narration tightens, turning the personal into the vast. Between 1943 and 1946, over 371,000 German POWs were held in the United States, spread across more than 500 camps from Maine to California. Texas alone hosted 32. Few realized these barbed enclosures would become classrooms of quiet transformation, places where ideology was not beaten out, but worn away by routine, decency, and the unfamiliar luxury of dignity. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. Share your location and local time in the comments. It connects the present to the places where these shadows once stood. Tonight, our story begins with a helmet that once touched the wind, and the man who must now learn to live without it. When they searched him, they found no weapon, no insignia of value, only a worn leather notebook. Its edges were blackened by oil, corners soft from being opened too often. The guard flipped it open, expecting coordinates or coded targets. Instead, he found sketches, clouds, the curved fuselage of a Messerschmitt, a pair of hands holding a cup, and finally, a woman's face. The guard frowned, running his thumb over the pencil marks. "You drew this up there?" he asked. The German looked down. "To remember the ground." That answer unsettled the young American. It didn't sound like the enemy he had imagined. To him, Germans were mechanical, uniformed, identical. Yet this man, whose aircraft had dropped fire over North Africa, carried clouds in his pocket. Karl Hoffmann had begun the notebook in 1941, when the Luftwaffe still believed the sky belonged to them. Between raids, he would sketch the light over the Alps or the curve of smoke above a burning convoy. He once wrote, "The air shows us everything from above, except what it does to the people below." The book had traveled through Sicily, Tobruk, and finally the desert crash that ended his flying days. In Camp Hearne, that small notebook became a bridge, silent but impossible to ignore. The guards passed it among themselves, astonished that the same hand which had aimed at them could draw with such gentleness. Historians later found dozens of similar sketchbooks in POW archives across America, drawn by Luftwaffe and Wehrmacht soldiers alike. The U.S. Air Force Museum still preserves several: rough pencil landscapes, portraits of guards, scenes of mess halls, even attempts to capture the endless Texas horizon. To the American command, these notebooks were harmless. To the men who made them, they were the only way to survive invisibly. Every morning, Karl was assigned to the maintenance detail, repairing fences, painting barracks, cleaning the small library that housed donated American novels. Sometimes he would slip a page from his notebook between the covers of Mice and Men, as if to leave a secret message for whoever opened it next. He later wrote in the margins, "I draw because words have borders, but clouds do not." The guards began calling him the artist. They would hand him chalk to draw signs for the camp theater, where POWs performed German plays for themselves. In exchange, he received a few extra sheets of paper from the supply office, a trade more valuable than cigarettes. There was an afternoon when he sat by the fence sketching the American Guard Tower. The man on duty, Sergeant Richard Alcott, shouted down jokingly, "Don't forget to make me taller." Karl lifted the notebook, smiled faintly, and sketched another line. That line, historians later noted, was higher than the tower itself. It was not mockery, it was acknowledgement. As days stretched into months, that notebook began to define him more than his rank or uniform. Other POWs teased him for it, until they too began to ask for portraits to send home. In a place where letters were censored and futures uncertain, a small drawing of a wife's eyes or a child's toy carried more meaning than medals ever could. In 1944, the Red Cross recorded that Camp Hearne distributed over 12,000 sheets of drawing paper. More than any other Texas camp, creativity became survival. Each line was a quiet rebellion against despair. At night, Hoffmann kept his notebook under his pillow. He no longer sketched dogfights or aircraft diagrams. Instead, he drew ordinary things: a cup steaming in the morning, a shovel resting in dirt, a distant bird flying without orders. He wrote one final entry on the back page: "Perhaps to lose the sky is to finally see the earth." It began, as most things did in Camp Hearne, with an unexpected kindness. The morning air smelled faintly of coffee, a scent that confused Karl Hoffmann the first time he caught it drifting through the open window of Barrack 14. Coffee meant officers' mess, silk uniforms, pre-war Vienna. Yet here, it poured from tin pots in an American camp that held 6,000 men behind barbed wire. The camp kitchen was enormous, run by American staff with help from German prisoners assigned to kitchen duty. The first time Hoffmann stepped inside, he froze. The head cook was a broad-shouldered black man named Joseph Turner from Alabama, a civilian contracted by the Army. He greeted Karl with a nod, ladle in hand. "You eat same as the rest, Captain Sky," he said, smiling at his own nickname for the quiet pilot. Hoffmann stared at the trays: bacon, white bread, beans, even fruit on Wednesdays. "For prisoners?" he asked. Turner laughed. "For workers. You work, you eat. That's the rule." The Luftwaffe pilot carried his breakfast to the long wooden table, but the smell of bacon unsettled him. In wartime Europe, ration cards ruled every bite. His wife had written to him in 1942 that she stood in line for 2 hours for a few grams of butter. Yet here in the enemy's camp, there was food enough to waste. He looked around and saw what stunned many Germans held in America: abundance without arrogance. Guards drank from the same pots as prisoners. Black and white soldiers shared shifts in the kitchen. The Germans whispered that this must be propaganda, that the Americans were staging equality for show, but the show never ended. It was routine. During the first week, Karl met 2 other officers who had flown in North Africa: Lieutenant Emil Kruger, who still carried a charm of sand in a glass vial, and Feldwebel Otto Brandt, a mechanic who missed the sound of engines. They would sit together by the barrack stove, sharing rumors from home. Otto once said, "They feed us like allies, not captives. Perhaps they are trying to make us soft." Karl answered quietly, "Or perhaps they are not afraid." At the end of March 1944, the camp command announced a lecture program. Prisoners could attend classes taught by university professors brought from nearby colleges. Some studied English, others agriculture, even music theory. Out of boredom, Karl joined the group sketching landscapes under the guidance of an old Texan artist who volunteered once a week. The man gave them charcoal and paper, said nothing about ideology, only about light and shadow. Hoffmann realized for the first time that beauty could be neutral. It didn't belong to one flag. Still, the camp was not paradise. There were fights, resentments, and small humiliations. The Texas heat punished everyone the same. Some officers refused to work, insisting the Geneva Convention excused them from labor. But the Americans held firm and pragmatic. They paid the POWs 80 cents a day in camp coupons, redeemable for cigarettes, soap, or writing paper. In 1944 alone, the U.S. Army paid German prisoners over $2 million in wages nationwide, an irony not lost on the men whose homeland was collapsing. At night, when the lights dimmed, the guards played Glenn Miller records. Karl often listened through the thin barrack wall. Moonlight serenade carried through the air, haunting in its gentleness. He wrote in his notebook, "They fight with bombs, but soothe with music." One morning, Sergeant Turner poured him extra coffee and said, "You know, my brother fought in Italy. Maybe one day you two meet after all this." Karl smiled weakly. "If I live, tell him I won't be flying." For the first time, he laughed at his own words. A small, startled sound. Turner laughed too. And the men around them, American and German alike, began to see that the line dividing enemy and guest had started to blur. He ended that day sitting by the fence, staring at the distant fields where the horizon looked limitless, free of war, free even of sky. He whispered, "To forget pride is harder than losing wings." The camera lingers there, a man with coffee in his hand, the steam rising like memory. The first time Karl Hoffmann saw the Texas fields, he thought they looked like the sea, endless, rippling, alive with light. The camp gates opened that morning for a work detail. A convoy of army trucks took 40 prisoners out to help local farmers harvest cotton. It was late September 1944, and the heat shimmered like glass above the soil. In the truck, the men sat in silence, clutching their canteens. Some whispered that it was a trick, a test of loyalty. Others were simply grateful to breathe air, not caged by wire. Karl, the former pilot, pressed his hand to the wind as the truck moved. The same wind that once lifted his aircraft, now passing through his fingers like forgiveness. The farmer who received them was James Walker, a man in his 50s with sunburned arms and the calm authority of someone who had survived more droughts than wars. He greeted them politely, almost formally. "You help me, I feed you," he said. Simple as that. The men nodded. Work began. They were given gloves and burlap sacks, shown how to pick without damaging the cotton. The first few hours broke every illusion Karl had about strength. The heat pressed down like a living thing, sweat filled his eyes, the soil clung to his knees. Each pull of the plant tore his fingers raw. By noon, they were served lunch under a pecan tree. Sandwiches, apples, and water, chilled in a galvanized tub. Walker sat with them, breaking bread from the same loaf. It was the first time Karl had eaten beside an American civilian. He expected interrogation, maybe mockery, but Walker only asked, "Where'd you learn to draw?" Karl blinked. "From the clouds." Walker laughed softly. "Never met a man who learned something useful from a cloud." He passed him another slice of bread. That small gesture became a legend among the prisoners. In a world divided by steel and suspicion, a farmer shared his lunch with the enemy. Karl wrote about it later. "It was not the bread that moved me, but the silence that followed. The silence of two men eating without hate." Real reports from Texas farms confirm such stories. Between 1943 and 1945, over 80,000 German POWs worked in American agriculture, replacing local men who had gone to war. They picked cotton, harvested wheat, repaired barns. Many farmers later testified that they had come to respect the efficiency and discipline of their German laborers. Some even sent letters of character reference when repatriation began. That afternoon, as work resumed, local children appeared at the edge of the field, barefoot, curious, whispering to each other. One boy approached, no older than 10, holding a stick. "You're a pilot, right?" he asked, wide-eyed. Karl hesitated, then nodded. The boy pointed to the dirt and said, "Show me how the plane looked." Karl knelt down and drew a Messerschmitt cockpit with the stick. The boy crouched beside him, tracing the outline of wings with his fingers. "Was it scary up there?" the child asked. Karl paused. "It still is," he answered. The boy didn't understand, but Walker, watching from a distance, did. He saw a soldier relearning humility, one handful of soil at a time. When the trucks drove back that evening, the POWs sang softly in German, their voices mixing with the hum of the engine. Karl looked at his hands, blistered but steady. For the first time since capture, he felt something close to peace. He wrote that night in his notebook, "Today I met a man who owned no rank, no medals, and yet carried more authority than all our generals. He commanded with kindness." The next morning, when the farmer returned for another work detail, Karl offered him a small drawing. The field, the tree, and two hands breaking bread. Walker looked at it, smiled, and said, "You draw good, Captain Sky. Maybe next time you draw rain." It did rain a week later. The guards said it was luck. Karl called it grace. Evening descended slowly over Camp Hearne. The Texas air, once golden and hot, turned blue and heavy with crickets. In Barrack 14, men gathered around the long wooden table where a single lamp hummed faintly. Someone had smuggled in a Red Cross bulletin, news of Allied advances, the collapse of the Eastern Front, the encirclement of Wehrmacht divisions in France. Arguments began quietly, then grew sharp. Lieutenant Emil Kruger slammed his fist on the table. "Propaganda," he said. "The Americans invent victory to make us obedient." Across from him, Karl Hoffmann looked up from his drawing. "Then how do you explain silence from Berlin?" Otto Brandt, the mechanic, stared at his hands. "I received no letter for 3 months, not one. If they were winning, they would write." The barracks split into two camps, those who still believed in the fatherland's destiny and those who had seen too much to believe in anything. The discussion turned to politics, then morality, then the nature of defeat. Karl said softly, "I have seen America from the inside. They do not fear us. They do not hate us. That frightens me more than hatred." The men fell quiet. Outside, a train whistle echoed from the distance. In that moment, the sound of machinery carried more authority than ideology. Historical records confirm that by 1944, German POW camps in America had become arenas of fierce ideological conflict. The U.S. War Department classified prisoners into three categories: hardcore Nazis, moderates, and non-political. Camp Hearne was considered Category B, mixed loyalties, constant tension. Debates often turned violent. Secret cells of loyalists tried to enforce discipline, even intimidation. But Barrack 14 was different. It had thinkers, doubters, men who questioned rather than obeyed. Hoffmann, with his calm reasoning and sketches of ordinary life, became an accidental center of gravity. Some called him Der Denker, the thinker. Others whispered that he had gone soft. One evening, he found the notebook on his bunk, torn, pages ripped, the drawing of the Texas field missing. Inside, a note read, "Remember who you are, not what they want you to be." He said nothing. Instead, he repaired the notebook with tape, copied the missing sketch from memory, and drew a small bird perched on the fence above it. Beneath, he wrote, "Freedom is not a flag, it's the courage to see another truth." The guards noticed the growing friction. To ease tension, they allowed selected prisoners to attend lectures on American history and democracy, supervised by the YMCA War Prisoner Aid Committee. At first, many attended for the cigarettes offered as incentive, but the discussions, especially about the U.S. Constitution and racial segregation, stirred unexpected curiosity. One American lecturer asked, "Do you believe freedom can exist under orders?" Karl answered, "No, but discipline without freedom builds perfect soldiers and broken men." His words reached even the guards. Sergeant Turner, the camp cook, later said in an interview, "That German Karl, he spoke like someone digging his way out of something heavier than a prison." The next day, Karl sat alone under the guard tower, watching clouds drift like fleets above the horizon. He remembered his days in flight school, the certainty, the uniform shine of youth, and felt them dissolving. He wrote, "To believe only in the wind was my arrogance. To listen to silence is my education." That night, Barrack 14 was quieter. The arguments had exhausted themselves. A few men played harmonica. Others wrote letters that would never reach home. And Karl, sitting near the stove, drew his last image of that day, a small cup of coffee beside a shadow shaped like wings. The scene fades on that drawing, simple, unremarkable, but carrying the quiet rebellion of a man who no longer salutes lies. What do you think changes a person more, defeat, or being treated with unexpected kindness? The night the radio came alive, even the guards stood still. It was May 8th, 1945, the day Germany surrendered. The air in Texas carried no triumph, no noise, only static. The camp's old shortwave receiver had broken days before, its tubes cracked from overuse. Karl Hoffmann volunteered to help fix it. "You used to fly, now you repair wings made of wires," Sergeant Turner joked, handing him a wrench. Hoffmann smiled faintly. "All machines break when they forget their purpose." Together, they pried open the radio's back panel. The inside was a forest of wires, dust, and forgotten music. Turner held the flashlight. Karl adjusted the copper coil, humming under his breath. He had learned this patience from long missions, the same calm that once guided him through flak storms over Malta. When the signal finally returned, the voice that came through was brittle, uncertain. It was a BBC broadcast from London. A pause, then a phrase in English. "Germany has surrendered. The war in Europe is over. No one cheered, not the Americans, not the Germans. The sound hung in the air, heavier than silence. Someone whispered a prayer. Another man took off his cap. Karl kept staring at the glowing tubes, their light trembling like candle flames. He murmured, "Now the sky is free again." The camp commandant read the official confirmation that evening. Some prisoners wept, others refused to believe it. A few sang Lily Marlene under their breath, the song of a war that had finally gone quiet. Across America, more than 370,000 German POWs listened to the same words that night. Reports say many guards, overwhelmed, left their posts temporarily to stand outside and look at the stars. At Camp Hearne, one guard noted in his diary, "They did not look defeated, just emptied, as if the war had walked out of their bodies." After the announcement, Turner offered Karl a cigarette. "You okay, Captain Sky?" Karl nodded. "Yes, only I don't know who won." The next morning, the camp changed. The guards no longer shouted. Work details slowed. Men walked softer, spoke less. A strange peace, fragile and raw, filled the air. For the first time, the barbed wire looked unnecessary. Later that week, a chaplain offered voluntary church service for both sides. The room overflowed, no sermons, just silence. Karl sat in the back row, watching sunlight strike the wooden cross. It reminded him of a propeller, spinning, ceasing, forgiving. Afterward, he returned to his bunk and drew in his notebook, 2 hands repairing a broken radio, wires turned into vines. Underneath, he wrote, "When machines stop fighting, perhaps men can learn." Outside, the guards lowered the American flag to half-mast, not for the dead alone, but for the end of something immense. That night, Karl and Turner shared one last pot of coffee. Neither spoke. They listened to crickets and to a faint jazz tune leaking from the radio, the same one they had fixed together. Before lights out, Karl asked quietly, "Do you think people can start again?" Turner answered, "Only if they remember what ended them." If you had been there that night, hearing your homeland surrender, would you have felt sorrow or relief? The morning of departure came without ceremony. August 1946. The Texas air was thick with dust, the same dry heat that had greeted them 3 years before. Trucks lined the camp road, each marked with chalk letters, "Release, return to Europe." Karl Hoffmann folded his few belongings, a notebook, a pencil, a single letter never sent. The guard called his name with a clipped American accent. "Hoffmann, Karl, Luftwaffe." He stepped forward, saluted half-heartedly, and glanced once more at Barrack 14. The coffee pot still stood on the stove, a thin wisp of steam rising from it like memory. He had spent 1,067 days behind those fences, learning to see the world in shades of gray instead of black and white. He no longer thought of himself as pilot or prisoner, victor or vanquished, only as a witness to how quietly a man could change. Before leaving, he tore a page from his notebook and pinned it to the camp's bulletin board. His handwriting was steady, deliberate. "If someday your children fly, teach them to land kindly." A guard noticed, read it twice, and left it there. The note remained for weeks, yellowing under the Texas sun. Decades later, archivists at the Camp Hearne Museum would find the page preserved between war ration records, anonymous, unsigned, but still carrying the imprint of a man who once believed the sky belonged to him. The train carried the prisoners south toward Galveston, where ships waited to return them to Europe. As the wheels clattered, Karl gazed out the window. He saw farmers in distant fields, small white houses, and a boy chasing a paper airplane through the wind. The sight drew a smile, a tiny, private forgiveness. On the ship bound for Bremerhaven, the men lined the deck, staring eastward. None spoke. They expected a home that no longer existed. Germany in 1946 was a graveyard of cities, rubble piled where streets once led to bakeries, cinemas, and churches. Allied surveys recorded 4.7 million buildings destroyed, 20 million people displaced, and a sky choked with dust from burned archives. When the ship finally docked, the Red Cross greeted them with blankets and forms. Their new homeland smelled of smoke and surrender. Yet amid the ruins, Karl found an unexpected letter waiting, sent months earlier from Texas. The handwriting was familiar, James Walker. The note was short. "Harvest came early this year. The field looked empty without you boys. My wife still keeps your drawing in the kitchen. When I see it, I remember that good men can be found on both sides of a bad war." Karl read it twice, then folded it carefully into his notebook. He would later tell a fellow returnee, "They captured my body in 1943. They released my pride in 1946. In the years that followed, Hoffmann rebuilt a small life in Hamburg, working as an aircraft mechanic for civilian transport planes. He never flew again. He kept the notebook on his desk, its final page blank. One evening in 1958, he visited an airfield outside Hanover. A group of young pilots, barely 20, were training in gleaming new Cessnas. One of them recognized him. "Herr Hoffmann, you are Luftwaffe?" and asked for advice. Karl paused, looked at the sky, now clear and forgiving, and said, "Always remember, the ground is where people live. Do not forget it." He turned away as the planes ascended, the sound of engines merging with the soft rhythm of wind through grass. For the first time, he did not flinch when he looked up. He had, at last, learned to land kindly. Years later, the story of Oberleutnant Karl Hoffmann would fade into the quiet margins of history, preserved not in military records, but in the artifacts of a man who rediscovered his humanity inside a prison fence. His cracked helmet still hangs at Camp Hearne, the tag rusted, the strap frayed. Visitors rarely notice the small inscription beneath it. Recovered, 1943. Yet for those who linger, the air around it still carries the faint echo of that first question. That yours? The notebook, too, survives, sealed in the climate-controlled archive of the U.S. Air Force Museum. On its last page, curators found a fingerprint smudged over graphite clouds, a small trace of the pilot who drew the sky even when it no longer belonged to him. For historians, these are mere objects. For storytellers, they are evidence of something far greater, that even in captivity, a man can reclaim his freedom by understanding his own reflection. Between 1943 and 1946, the United States held more than 371,000 German prisoners across 500 camps. Less than 1% attempted escape. Most, like Hoffmann, returned home changed. Not through re-education or coercion, but through small encounters. A farmer sharing his bread, a guard sharing silence, a cook offering coffee. These gestures, multiplied across thousands of days, built a bridge between two worlds that had once sworn each other's destruction. Historians often call it the quiet experiment, the unspoken diplomacy of dignity. Yet beneath statistics lies something more fragile, the realization that moral victories are rarely celebrated, only lived. The transformation of one man in one camp cannot rewrite the war, but it can remind us what victory should have meant all along. Not domination, but understanding. In later years, former POWs wrote to their American hosts, sending Christmas cards, photographs, and letters of gratitude. Some returned to visit the towns where they had once labored. In Brenham, in Hearne, in little corners of Texas, those visits were met not with parades, but with handshakes and coffee refilled without asking. If there is a single image that remains, it is this: an old pilot standing under an open sky, watching others take flight. No bitterness, no pride, only a long exhale of peace. His final words, written in the notebook, discovered decades later, were simple. War took my wings. America gave me eyes. The camera would pull back slowly from that sentence, leaving the audience suspended in quiet reflection, as if hovering above both history and forgiveness. And perhaps that is the truest legacy of Karl Hoffmann, that the sky he once forgot became, in the end, the one place where mercy could still exist.